We remove ourselves sometimes as environmentalists from these social political landscapes because we're like, well, green energy, renewable energy is the better way to go. And yes, it's a better way to go. But I think that when we start looking at energy through this binary lens, which is taught in physics, where it's like removed from humans, we forget that even when we're extracting lithium, there is people, there is land that's being desecrated. And I think that that's one of the things that I talk about when we teach energy. We should look at the history, and a simple history lesson makes students even realize that it's beyond just work. It's beyond this equation that they can solve with variables. It's actually, it has social political implications.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Jessica Hernandez. Jessica is an indigenous climate scientist and the author of Fresh Banana Leaves and her new book, Growing Papaya Trees, in which she argues that all environmental and climate problems stem from colonialism. Growing Papaya Trees is a really beautiful book. It weaves family history with lived experience, with Earth's body and Earth's experience, and different cultures around the world to try and grapple with the roots of these violence that grow through us and into the land, causing these systemic global problems that will change everything this century. And Jessica walks us through that on this episode, discussing the impact of displacement, being uprooted, the necessary relationships between land and people, indigeneity and what it means. From there, we discuss the creation of a global indigenous identity that we see today, with Jessica giving a very nuanced overview of both the benefits and the potential harms. And that leads us into a wide-ranging conversation about the necessity of nuance. We talk about what happens when you lose sight of history, the reality of indigenous empires that existed before the conquistadors arrived, the displacement of non-indigenous people as well, the trauma that it creates, which then spills out into how we organize our societies, and the critical difference between placing blame and taking accountability. And that leads us nicely into a conversation about renewable energy, the negative impacts that it's having on Indigenous peoples around the world, and the absolute necessity of moving beyond this binarized perception of the world in order to truly understand our place in it, our impact, and our potential. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Jessica, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Paducci. That's thank you in my language. Thank you for having me here today.
My first question for you before we dive into your book that's just come out is, why is the world in crisis?
Wow, I think that that is a very multifaceted question. I think that our world is in crisis because we have lost our relationship with nature. And I say that because, most of us live in cities. It's kind of hard to have access to nature. We also have been normalized to see nature as something that we can own, something that we can extract from. We live in a very consumeristic driven society where we want to purchase the latest gadgets, purchase, more than what we actually need. So I think the world is in crisis because we have been taught ways that do not necessarily align with indigenous ways that at one point in time, right, everybody had those indigenous ways. It's just industrialization, it's just urbanization, and the civilization in general with the integration of technology has adapted a new mindset. So I would say that's one of the major reasons why the planet is in crisis.
Excellent. Yeah. And you've written this book, Growing Papaya Trees, which is it safe to say it's almost like an educational piece for non-indigenous peoples to learn about indigenous ways of seeing, indigenous ways of being, and speaking through your own experience and your parents' experience with your culture, and allowing also then the land to speak through you as an indigenous person and what Earth herself needs. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I think that oftentimes when we talk, especially because the book talks about displacement, when we talk about displacement or migration, we often see that as something that is not interconnected with environmentalism or anything related to the environment. So I wanted to tie that in because as indigenous peoples, we have faced so much displacement, whether it be internal or external across borders. And it continues to happen even today. So I think that's a great summary for the book.
Well, let's start there then with this question of displacement. Um, and my listeners will know this, but I was recently in the Kimberley with an Aboriginal community and interviewing some of the elders. And the message from them was very clear. Like, without us, the land will get sick, the spirits will die. We are all in relationship. Obviously, we need Earth, like we are her children, but she also needs us in order to be well. And I found that to be a really beautiful message that I think sort of combats some of the pessimism around the impact of humankind as a virus or a bacteria or whatever, and kind of reframed us as like, no, we have the possibility to be a keystone species. And we know that through the fact that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is stewarded by indigenous people, or the fact that the Amazon rainforest, which we see as this sort of natural wonder of the world, was also planted in many parts by indigenous people, and the soil was enriched by indigenous people. And so we have this capacity to be, well, to be gardeners, really, and bring so much of the world to life. Um, and so cordoning us off of the land, it doesn't just make us sick by, putting us in cities, as you were saying, but the land also gets sick.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with that because I think oftentimes when we look at our creation stories, especially in many indigenous communities, they might be different, but our creation stories tell us that we are a part of nature, we came from nature, and nature is a part of us. But oftentimes we see this like divide between humans and nature, right? Especially in mainstream environmentalism, where humans are basically destroying nature, and as a result, we should kind of, go to Mars or go somewhere else so that we can be away from nature. But nature needs us as much as we need nature, and nature protects us as long as we protect nature. And I think that oftentimes we forget that, right? When we have floods, it's the trees that buffer the rains from, that prevent us from getting our homes flooded. And oftentimes we forget that. And also, we are the ones, replanting trees. I don't think that the human species is basically just, I mean, we are destroying nature, but it's also not the solution to remove all humans from, these environments.
Completely. I like the idea as well of an environmental defense movement that is defensive in nature. Like, I'm sure you've seen that video of that orangutan attacking
Mm,
the bulldozer that was moving through the Bornean rainforest, which
mm,
is its home. And it's a really sort of startling and distressing image. And it also sort of shows that the best possible defenders against humans are also other humans. And so that was why historically with colonialism, if when the settlers wanted the lands of the Americas, the first thing that they had to do was get the indigenous people off of them, because if the indigenous people stayed on them, they would have defended their territory, defended their home, and defended the other beings that they consider their kinfolk.
mhm. Yeah, and that's true. And many indigenous communities did try to defend their environments, but obviously we didn't necessarily, our ancestors didn't have the technology, that settlers brought in, especially to eradicate us. We also didn't have the defenses to prevent us from dying from these diseases that they introduced. And I think that oftentimes, even looking at that image, animals have this amazing intelligence that we often discredit, right? Because I can assume that this orangutan had seen, you know, this, humans destroy its environment. And he or she or it knew that that was what was causing them to experience this habitat loss. But oftentimes we ignore animals. Like animals don't necessarily have a voice in this society because there are inferior species in comparison to how as humans we have created these societies where there are species hierarchy and we are at the top, right? Oftentimes when we go to an environmental course, that's the one hierarchy that we learn, right? How humans are the species like at the food chain, and we often forget that animals are as intelligent as us.
Yeah, completely. I had Christine Webb on recently, and she was saying some amazing stuff, some amazing research that's come out about speciesism, and
Mhm.
essentially showing that like children up until the age of 3.5 do not see any differences between human beings and animals. Like they see us
Oh, cool.
all as belonging to one family essentially. And then at about 4.5, 5, there's that sudden shift of that we are different to animals. We belong to a different
Mhm.
group, and she maintains that that's because of the stories that we're telling culturally and how we speak about
Yeah.
animals and the way that we eat animals and all of
Mhm.
this kind of thing sort of promotes a unnecessary division, not just a hierarchy, but like an absolute division of like, I don't think about you as my family because of the violence that my culture enacts against you. So I have to
Mhm.
create these mental hurdles in order to justify it. And it starts so young.
Yeah. And it's very similar to racism, right? Like it's like something that it's taught to students where it's like this community is lesser than us or we are lesser. And I think that it's very interesting how we can even portray that even within other animals as well, other animal species.
Yeah, there's some amazing research that's only been done in the last sort of 5, 6 years that has shown that there is a connection between how people think about nature or animal species as being lesser and
Oh,
heightened racism in those people as well.
oh, oh,
So
wow.
yeah, and also heightened sexism. So there's this like I always like to say it's all the bad stuff trickles down. Economics that doesn't trickle down, but all of these things, the way that we think about our environment and the world, it all trickles into our relationships with other human beings as well. So frankly, you just can't get away with being ideologically violent in one arena of your life and not being ideologically violent in other arenas.
Yeah, that's crazy, right? Yeah.
While we're here, I suppose if I was to do this interview properly, I would sort of do this towards the end. But I want to kind of skip ahead a bit and then we'll come back and talk about this global identity of Indigenous people that sort of popped up, I would say, probably in the last 8 years, maybe, especially since COP conferences started inviting people to come out of the forest and speak on behalf of everyone else and on behalf of Earth. And it has created this sort of mass group essentially of probably the single most diverse group of human cultures and languages and practices in the world, and they all get put under the umbrella of indigenous peoples. Do you think that's helpful?
I think it's helpful in some ways because it brings in indigenous voices. Like it does, like as you mentioned, it allows for folks who don't necessarily have the means to have a platform because oftentimes there is this pessimism, especially as somebody who has attended the COPs and also has represented her community or even organization that I worked in, that I was employed in, where people believe that COPs do not necessarily create any changes. But I think that oftentimes we forget that for the global south is the only platform that many folks have, especially to advocate for the environment, to advocate for the land rights. And yes, the UN doesn't necessarily have jurisdictions to promote certain rights or certain policies globally because it doesn't just have the political power. Obviously, every country has some political power. But I also think that with that, well, I think the term that sometimes harms indigenous peoples the most is when we use indigenous peoples and local communities because that is lumping local communities can be seen as non-indigenous. It can be communities that colonize certain communities, but somewhat share of that identity. And oftentimes we see that a lot in the continent of Africa, right, where it was other Africans who colonized certain countries in Africa, and then with indigenous peoples and local communities, or even in Latin America, especially where I come from, where mestizos who don't necessarily who claim to have indigenous ancestry but do not necessarily are indigenous or support indigenous peoples can also be lumped into indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think that it does do a justice, but it also creates disadvantages, right? Like I think that because indigenous peoples, we're not a monolith, it's hard to create terms that are one size fits all because this term might harm many indigenous communities, especially one of the things that, being raised in as a displaced indigenous woman has always been that, I get identified as indigenous, but when it comes to my communities, I identify myself with my families, my grandparents, and then my pueblo, which is my indigenous community. And it's very different, right? Because every time they introduce me, right, they're like, oh, she's an indigenous scientist. But when it comes to who I am as an indigenous scientist, there's more to that. So I think it's just these ways of categorizing many groups, especially in Western ways of thinking. And I think that we see that a lot in the US, where oftentimes even indigenous peoples from Africa will be labeled Africans, or indigenous peoples from Latin America will be labeled Latino or Latina, and not necessarily even have those nuances. I think it's kind of in a similar way trying to create this terminology to be inclusive, but I think when it's lumped with local communities and many indigenous leaders have spoken, it creates more harm than good because then you're not just necessarily focusing on indigenous sovereignty or self-determination. You're also focusing on other rights that do not necessarily align with what indigenous rights or sovereignty are necessarily.
Interesting. I really enjoyed the chapter in your book, the first chapter about displacement, because for me, it continued to just reiterate the necessity of land for indigenous language and indigenous culture, and this sort of this constant being with as an indigenous person with the land. And that if you are displaced from your land, something does happen. It's not that you become non-indigenous, but something does happen there. There is a violence there, and I think that it's very different to the Western, Western way of thinking. The again, all that is human comes just from the head. Like all of human culture just comes from your brain. So it doesn't really matter where we are. We will just do the same thing over and over and over again because ultimately we are in control of our destinies and we are in control of who we are. And I think that you can obviously see that experiment go wrong in the United States with white people, quite frankly, because listen, I think it's pretty safe to say, I mean, that country is losing its mind. The people are collectively losing their minds right now. And I'm sure that that's because of the displacement that happened
Yeah.
250 years ago. I'm sure sorry, I shouldn't be so glib. I'm sure that that hugely plays into it. You take a people that are used to the world looking one way and being one way and there being one way in it, and you dump them somewhere else with a legacy of huge violence that they have to enact in a place that looks completely different. Well, of course they're gonna lose their minds over the generations. Where can they put that? Where are their roots? They are also
Yeah.
an uprooted people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's very interesting because, Americans often say, oh, I have Finnish ancestry or I have English ancestry or Australian, but not necessarily living or abiding by those communities, by that culture that that community fosters. And I think that that is true, right? In America, there's has been this project where, no matter where you come from, maybe you are, as you mentioned, white, you are considered, you kind of have assimilated to this American identity while, sometimes neglecting that there are other cultural or communities that basically make you as a person. I think that this country is very interesting because in Latin America, it's kind of similar, right? Where everybody has adapted this mestizo kind of identity while forgetting indigenous cultures or communities that they come from, or actually oppressing them because they're also abiding to this Spaniard identity that makes them white, right? So there is always this whiteness project that has happened throughout the Americas where everybody tries to assimilate to the whiteness that that country kind of upholds and completely ignores their true cultural identity. And I think that it's a very interesting remark that you made.
That's so interesting. I was recently in Colombia with our project Planet Coordinate, making films with communities around the front lines of existential crisis, and spent an extraordinary 2 weeks with an organization called Visión Sureste
Mm.
in the Andean mountains, who've been successfully held back a gold mine for 25 years from ripping up their mountain. And they are amazing. And they've essentially woven all of these different people into this resistant network. There are the campesinos, the peasant farmers, there's
Yeah.
the youth, there's the indigenous people, there's the local councillors. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement. But for me, it was really interesting to hear essentially about, these capitalist forces moving in, essentially like the
Mhm.
white man, like the white man's
Mhm.
culture moving in, and how the pressure of this external violence has managed to create like a collective identity of very, very different people, some of who descend from colonizers themselves, essentially, some of whom descend from Spaniards that came over, conquistadors that came over, because not everyone we spoke to was indigenous. Therefore, the rest, and
Yeah.
it was really interesting to sort of see how it kind of reminded me of what Franz Fanon said in The Wretched of the Earth, the essentially
Mhm.
defending oneself from political violence creates a shared political identity, like creates a
Mhm.
nation immediately out of
Initially,
disparate
yeah.
groups. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, but also, I don't know, I had this, if I spoke better Spanish, I would have been able to get into it more. But I was like, oh, I wonder how much history is also sort of being um, edited slightly here,
Mhm.
so that
Mhm.
it's always been the white man, when actually, frankly, the history of violence extends all across the world, all
Yeah.
across millennia. And if history begins 500 years ago, then we're in danger of missing the problems that exist everywhere all the time and just sort of repackaging it in the next system.
Yeah, and I think that's very similar to my Maya communities, right, where my father comes from, because there was a genocide that happened against indigenous peoples, especially in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras. But it was also the campesinos who actually stood by us and fought back,
There you
right? Because
go.
it was
Yeah.
it was that. So I think that there's that shared history, but obviously it was other Salvadorians that we look at the national identity who were leading this work, who were getting a lot of funding from the United States, from other countries, because they were using the C word, right? Communism. That they wanted to spread communism across El Salvador and Central America. So they got a lot of forces, a lot of military weapons. But when we look at the history, it wasn't just indigenous peoples who were persecuted. It was also campesinos who also wanted to fight to protect the land, but didn't necessarily hold that indigenous identity, but also held or had those same values that we had as indigenous peoples, where we wanted to protect our lands and not necessarily allow the government to sell them to these international monocultural plantations. But they experience a lot of violence. Even it's also very interesting because in Central America, right, religion also had a like kind of like an influence in protecting indigenous peoples, because there was a lot of priests who gave their lives protecting indigenous peoples, and these campesinos, especially as the genocide was targeting children. And I think that that's a very interesting component of history, where it's not just indigenous peoples oftentimes, protecting their lands. It's also other local communities, or even with that indigenous peoples and local communities, there's so much history that needs to be acknowledged. And I think this debate in global stages where indigenous peoples are like, oh, indigenous peoples and local communities can create harm. And I see that, but also it's context, what is it? Is it based on context, right? Because in my communities, they were local communities who also supported, my father's lineage, especially when this genocide was taking place.
It's so important to know these stories, to understand that
Yeah.
history is always nuanced, that people's morality can also shine through them no matter what
Mhm.
culture or system that they come from. And ultimately, I think oftentimes people do want good things for their neighbors. But if we could go to the other side of the coin, because your father's Mayan, and the Mayans built an empire. And the Mayans also, they had a slave class as well, where they would displace other indigenous groups essentially, in order to get access to the land and use the resources. And so this is the other thing about history not beginning sort of 500 years ago, and understanding this, whatever this is in us as creatures that allows us to sort of
Mhm.
enact this violence against one another. Obviously, the Mayan culture has completely changed now from before the
Mhm.
conquistadors arrived, because of the violence enacted against them, because 95% of indigenous people were killed on that continent.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, and I'm curious as to what do you, when you think back on that part of Mayan history, what do you think about it or feel about it?
Yeah, just think of all the ancient civilizations that were grand, right? Like you look at the Aztecs, you look at many tribes, even here in Alaska, throughout the United States, Canada, that had these great civilizations where they were conquering in a way, right? Like doing these wars against other communities and other indigenous tribes or nations. And I think that oftentimes it's sometimes embedded in certain communities, right? Because when I think of like sometimes the harm that I have experienced as an individual, sometimes it has been in indigenous spaces where it's, there's that healing component that needs to happen, and not necessarily everybody has healed. So they kind of replicate that lateral violence that often happens. And it's unfortunate that I have to say, right, that the most harm I have experienced has been in indigenous spaces, because I think that it's like every basket of apples always has a bad apple. And I think that even in these civilizations, it was a part of history that was also led by power, because, the civilizations that did gain most power that we read in the history books, even though there are descendants like the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, were doing all of these things. And I think that that's something that cannot be ignored, but also comes the way that they did these wars were completely different than what we experienced with settlers, because they it was just different. And I wish I could go back in history to kind of witness that and see what was it that it was different. But even with the Mayan civilization, in architecture books they said it collapsed, but there's so many Maya communities across southern Mexico all the way to Central America that are still here. It was just, I feel like we were displaced as a result of that. And because even when you hear other Mayan languages, it sounds similar. I mean, it's not the same, but I'm like, oh, that word kind of sounds familiar. Oh, okay, yeah, because we are all from the same kind of linguistic group, but obviously tied differently because of our environments are completely different. And then you add settler colonialism, then it kind of makes us to adapt to a newer environment than what we experienced during those. But very interesting observation and part of history. I wish I could go back and see what was actually happening. What were those discussions that the leaders were having, especially from these ancient civilizations that basically dominated most of Mexico, Central America, the United States, and Canada, as they're called now, right? Because obviously they were not called those countries back in the days.
I completely agree with you. I think all of these stories are such an important insight into our capacity to learn as well, our capacity to be incredibly flexible and adaptable and also sustainable. Like what practices can we do at scale and what practices can we not do at scale and what practices when we do them eventually tip into violent practices. How big can a civilization be before domination comes in? Is it about size or is it about, leaders in the past that essentially shifted the entire culture within a generation, which is completely possible when
Yeah.
when you use story, And I think I guess this is also kind of what I was getting at with regards to like the global indigenous identity,
Mhm.
because when it comes to whatever future we face on Earth herself and whatever future she faces, and every species that we belong to and that belongs to us, there's going to have to be some healing. We're going to have to do
Mhm.
some
Yeah.
really, really major healing. And for me, part of that healing is trying to recognize the commonalities as
Yeah.
often as possible. And so the commonalities of our problems, like our bad behavior historically and our
Mhm.
good behavior historically, and try to create a shared sense of human. Because right now, that's completely missing, a shared sense of what it is to be human. And I'm sorry, but it can't be that difficult. We are one species. Like our ontologies are fundamentally not going
Yeah,
to be
but
that different from one
we
another. You know
have
what I mean?
Mm.
And I worry about this divide of like, villain, goody, and problem solution, and just this continued binarized and very Western way of looking at the issue. And also the offsetting of accountability. Like, oh, we
Yeah.
screwed up and we're really bad. This kind of like sexual self-flagellation, like, oh, poor us, oh, bad us, oh, we're just gonna hand it over, we're not gonna give you any resources to do it, but like, oh, you'll know what to do, like, fuck off, figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. Because I think when we look at the wars that are happening today, the genocides that are happening, it's like there is this kind of hunger for power. And oftentimes when you look at what this power is, it's like property, it's land, it's political power that's not necessarily tangible, but it does allow people to do certain things that other folks like us, right, wouldn't be able to get away with it. And I think that oftentimes, yeah, there is that need for us to create solidarities with other communities that are different from us and not necessarily just hit an entire race or ethnicity as the villains, but also try to promote that. And I think that with even within indigenous communities, right, there is a lot of ongoing fights that happen, internal fights. And I think that that's just the complexity of being humans and being individuals with different mindsets, being raised differently. And sometimes even if you're raised in the same household, like my mom always tells me, children are like the fingers of your hands, right? They're not all the same, even though it's one hand. It's like your friend, right? You're like the person who moves your hand, in a certain way, but your children are very different, like all your fingers. And I think that that's true, right? Even as indigenous peoples, like we are different, like fingers. And I think that oftentimes we forget that even within communities, there is internal disputes, there's internal struggles, and oftentimes there is harm that we do to one another without just, putting the blame just on us as indigenous peoples, but oftentimes it's like these colonial things that we have been taught, and some of us have really captured and run away with them, right? And I think that all goes to power, whether it be educational power, society power, whatever kind of power that is being sought after that makes humans behave a certain way. And I think that that's sometimes true for all of these wars and genocides that are taking place, right? It's like this power to own more land than they already have. And I'm like, how does this make sense? But
Completely.
yeah.
Everything that you're saying resonates with me so much, because I've had to go through a whole learning process myself this year, kind of going into spaces and like being the only white woman and thinking that, well, I know what that means. I know what that means because I've read about what that means. And like, and also I think I'm a pretty good person. I think my work speaks to that. I live in tandem with my values. I sleep well at night, despite the impending, ecological doom. And yet, no, I didn't know. I had no bloody idea, because you have to experience these things. And for me, it's kind of going into these spaces and trying to like disentangle everything and getting lost in the weeds of like, well, how much am I me, and how much am I my culture, and how much am I my ancestry, and how much am I how I'm perceived,
Yeah.
and how much am I how I perceive myself, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, oh, actually, do you know what? There is no point in trying to figure out who is at blame here. Like placing blame is a futile exercise in such a complex world where we have lost sight of the cilia of history, the finest strands, because they were wrapped up into stories that were written by other people. The only thing we can do here is take accountability as to how we
Mhm.
move forward and how we choose
Yeah.
to move forward together.
Mhm. And I think that is true, right? Because I think when I recall myself being younger, there was always this like Jessica against the world, right? Like everything was a fight, everything was,
We do.
when I was in my teens, right? Like I was like everybody's against me, and I think that oftentimes it's maturity sometimes that we need, and sadly not all adults can get that maturity, right? Because there are adults who are well in their age, in their 50s or 60s, who still see the world against them, and they pick fights everywhere. I think that one of the things that sometimes amazes me is seeing adults in their 50s or 60s who make enemies everywhere they go. You're like, wait, what is going on there? There's this commonality that's not necessarily people, but it's like this mindset that when we are younger, we have to heal from and learn from, right? That not everything is against us. Not the whole world is not fighting against us. And people usually say, "Oh, you got to learn how to pick your fights," but there wouldn't be any fights to pick from if we didn't see everything as a fight. I mean, obviously, there are things that we should fight against, especially if it's impacting our communities and livelihoods. But oftentimes it's just dissociating ourselves from sometimes centering our ego too much into certain things. And I think that sometimes it's hard, right, for people to unlearn that because we learn that, like even we learn about self-esteem and like branding and everything that's very individualistic, right? And I think the ego sometimes tangles us and that clouds our judgment.
But even the nuance of that, like the ego is also important. You can't just say like, oh, my ego is bad, I'm gonna erase it and just be one with everyone. There's a reason that we have a
Mm,
skin barrier. There's a reason that we experience the world as contained within one subjectivity, and we gain an objective viewpoint by weaving in with other people's subjectivities and being
that's
curious and being
true.
interested. So like also your ego is kind of there to protect, not only protect you, but to be the conduit that allows you to be a useful viewpoint in the world, to
Mhm.
add to the tapestry of objectivity. And so this is what makes it all so complicated all the time. You have to hold the in-between space. You have to sit in the
Yeah,
in-between. You have
the
to
in
sit in
between.
the discomfort
Yeah.
in order to be useful. And God, our culture has not taught us that at all. Our culture has
No.
taught us seek comfort at any
Mm.
cost.
Yeah. Yeah, and even like you mentioning how the ego can be helpful, right? I think we haven't necessarily learned the good things about having an ego, right? So it's the bad things that we learn. And I think, yeah, being uncomfortable is where we grow, but also sometimes being uncomfortable is a signal to run away. Because sometimes there is, if you're experiencing harm or you're experiencing things that you shouldn't tolerate, that's also a discomfort that is not useful, right? That's not going to teach you anything but how to value yourself and be like, I need to leave now. Which, we see that in many relationships, whether it be professional or personal relationships, where being uncomfortable means that something is not right. But oftentimes there is sometimes a discomfort is because something is not right within us, right? But sometimes it's the environment that's not right.
Now, we could obviously talk for hours and continue down the tangent that we were just on, but let's go back into your book and try to find some of these nuances that you show, because I really want to pick out some of the things that you said. And I think for me, but also for the audience, one of the most interesting things that you critiqued was the way that we think about energy in physics and the terms that we use to define it, like power, work, heat. And you suggested that we could find a whole new way of looking at it that will liberate essentially our global societal relationship to our energy consumption. Please tell us everything that there is to know about that, because that is fascinating.
Yeah, so for my professional background, right, I'm a trained climate scientist, and I think that one of the things that I always found interesting was that even within climate science, we use a lot of physics. In physics, when we look at physics, everything in physics is abstract, is removed from society, is removed from humans. And not that we had a problem in environmental sciences, right, where we remove humans from nature, but in physics, it's like on a whole another level because this is what makes it a harder science. And I, do air quotes because, oftentimes we talk about hard sciences versus softer sciences. And physics is one of those sciences that's considered hard, like engineering as well. But when we look at the concept of energy, there is the historical component that's missing because if we look at the historical component of energy, energy was created to fuel ships that were coming from England to the Americas. It was a thing that was engineered and founded so that there was energy that could fuel these big ships to bring settlers into the Americas. But when we teach physics and we teach the concept of energy, which is a central theme of physics, we teach it as work, we teach it as equations, we teach it as heat or other things that do not necessarily attribute to the historical context. And I think having this conversation has been lovely because you mentioned how everything is tied to history, right? And even in the concept of energy, it's also tied to that history that it came during colonization, where England was going through the industrial period, and they were basically wiping all of their natural resources to the point that they didn't have any more trees, and they were trying to do trading agreements with some Asian or Southeast Asian countries, and the countries didn't necessarily want to. So they started creating that concept of energy as it is to fuel these ships so that they can explore other kind of environments, or they thought they were going sometimes to the Southeast Asian communities, so but not necessarily, right, because they landed in Americas. But I think that one of the things that I teach when I teach these hard concepts, or these concepts that are taught in these physical sciences, it's also the history. Like, where does this concept come from? And for many students, they start seeing physics as something completely different. But we still have these old school physicists who are like, physics should be removed from society. But even the concept of energy, right? We look at how energy is manifested in today's society, where even renewable energy has to be more nuanced, right? Because the way that we are extracting renewable energy sources is on indigenous lands. And we look at what's happening in the Republic of Congo, where we are, you know, I don't say we as in us too, but as a society, our demand for renewable energy and lithium batteries is making Congolese children have to work these mines and be oppressed and die, and there's like conflicts going on. But yet we remove ourselves sometimes as environmentalists from these social political landscapes, because we're like, well, green energy, renewable energy is the better way to go. And yes, it's a better way to go. But I think that when we start looking at energy through this binary lens, which is taught in physics, where it's like removed from humans, we forget that even when we're extracting lithium, there is people, there is lands that's being desecrated. And I think that that's one of the things that I talk about when we teach energy. We should look at the history, and a simple history lesson makes students even realize that it's beyond just work. It's beyond this equation that they can solve with variables. It's actually, it has social political implications even today, and as it did in the past.
I completely agree with you. Obviously, it's something I'd never thought about the definitions of these terms, and I think it's absolutely fascinating, this historical concept that you've just given to it, and then how, because these things become reified, like they get
Yeah.
separated from
Mhm.
the human creative system, essentially, and historical
Yeah.
context, then people think that's how it always has been, and that's how it must continue to be, and there
Yeah.
is nothing inherently harmful or good about this thing. And it's like, well, actually, if all of our energy historically has come from burning living beings or the bodies of ancient beings, then probably is something inherently harmful about that, actually, about the strategy at the very least. And I would like to get more into this problem with renewable energy. It is one of my big sort of
Mhm.
clarion calls. I'm so concerned. I'm so concerned about the uncritical championing of the green transition,
Yeah.
and also the term even a just transition, because I
Mhm.
hear that thrown around a lot. And don't get me wrong, I think it should be based in justice. But what does that mean? I haven't seen any extraction of renewable energy in a way that is
Mhm.
just so far. I just haven't seen it. Um, and also, just for who?
Mhm.
Because yeah, okay, maybe it could be just for indigenous people. Maybe. I highly doubt it. I mean, I think it's impossible within a capitalist extractive system. But what about our kinfolk? Do they get a voice? Do the rivers get a voice in being dammed in order to produce hydropower? Or does a mountain get a voice in being ripped open in order to extract gold for solar panels and wind turbines? Or does the land get a choice in order to be denuded in order to have these huge wind turbines placed on them? Like, don't get me wrong. Yes, of course, I think it's better than fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, obviously,
Mhm.
but I don't think that that just means it's good in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes we forget that, right? Because I do see just transition being used in these global convenings, like the COP conferences, where people are like, "Oh, we're advocating for a just transition," but even then, um, I I talk about my community in the book also in Thing Juan Tepec, Oaxaca, right? We had these wind turbines that were sold to our communities as these solutions to climate change, where we were, our communities were gonna have wind energy that they could harvest, where we could use these wind turbines to, in a way, address that energy efficiencies that we had, right? Because we are rural communities that don't necessarily have the power grids like in some cities. And yet, when these wind turbines were actually put in place, we started experiencing a lot of violence because, strangers or foreigners will come and they will do violence against our indigenous women, our leaders. And we also started seeing environmental degradation happening, like where birds were dying, and also our rivers were being polluted, but yet, it's this wind energy that's known to be clean energy, right? And oftentimes it's called clean energy, when in reality it's not necessarily clean, because sometimes it does have byproducts. It has contamination that is also produces. But also, like, how do we find the fine line, right? Because when we make those critiques, then people are like, oh, so you're pro fossil fuels. But in reality, there is more nuances to these conversations that need to take place. But, oftentimes it's hard, right? Because our governments are the ones who decide whether that's what they're going to do. And in the situation of my community was sold on it, but the government had already signed a contract. So even then, even if we had said no, or, it would have taken place. And I think oftentimes this just transition is just like, in a way, just asking us a simple question, or asking women a simple question, or asking indigenous peoples or the peasants, campesinos, a simple questions. And they're like, oh, we integrated them into this decision making, where in reality, there was a lot of contract negotiations happening behind doors, closed doors, that we never got to hear, right? Or we were not taught what the impacts will be on these certain things. And we're just sold this kind of solution, where reality, it sometimes it might be a solution to one problem, but then it creates many problems. It's like Western medicine, right? Where you take a pill and it's also a certain thing, but then you start getting all the side effects that because it makes you sicker. And I think we do need more people to think outside of the binaries, right? Because oftentimes even renewable energy is like, oh, this is a solution to fossil fuels. And there's so much complexities that have to be accounted for. But until we kind of unlearn to relearn not to think in binaries, I think we're gonna always have like a solution that creates more problems in the long term.
Yeah. How do you find speaking about this within the climate science environment?
It's I find it very diverse. And sometimes, climate science is very derived on physics, right? Where it's like modeling, you do these equations, you do this coding, you look at these satellite images, you kind of do look at these models to determine what's going on with our Earth. So I think that when I talk to those climate scientists that are more into like the physical sciences, like physics, coding, computer science, they have a harder time understanding. But when I talk to climate scientists who are more into the environmental sciences disciplines, or to know about indigenous peoples, they are more open to it. But I think that it's hard, right? Because it's sometimes you can say these things, and like we were discussing, right? You can be labeled as not necessarily having the best interest for everyone. But I think that hopefully with this new generation and seeing more books or articles being written about how we need to think more holistically, and how some of them are even criticizing renewable energy, we can look at different things. But I think that oftentimes is the so this is environmental economists that are bringing these solutions, right? So another thing that I talk about in the books are carbon credits, where, these multi-million or billion-dollar corporations can buy carbon credits in indigenous lands, are being stored by indigenous people, so that they can claim that they're mitigating their carbon footprint, where in reality they're emitting as much as they're buying. And then I was reading recently about these global biodiversity credits that are now being introduced as another solution in these global stages, where you have these political leaders deciding what's best for their country, while ignoring indigenous peoples, local communities, campesinos, Afro descendants, and other communities that are, as you were saying, the ones that pay the ultimate price for political decisions that are made without their consultation.
The biodiversity credits is absolutely nuts. For everyone listening, essentially, it's the same premise as the carbon credits, whereby if you want to build an airport and you have to cut down a piece of forest, then essentially you will have to the value of that biodiversity will be calculated, and you will buy the amount of credits that essentially will then pretend to be spent on protecting a forest somewhere else. And when we say it could be the other side of the country, the other side of the continent, it could be a completely different species. It has absolutely, it's completely ungrounded, unrealistic. It's a fallacy scheme. It has no concept of what ecology actually is. And I think what's just really distressing is this idea of like, imagine somebody killing your family member, like killing a family member, and then being like, it's okay though, because I've actually paid to have a child adopted. or I've paid to have another human being made somewhere else or whatever. It's completely it's just sick actually. It actually really upsets me. It's really sick.
Mhm. Yeah, and oftentimes these are the economical solutions, right? Because there's a lot of environmental economists, and I think that those are the people who I argue with the most, where they always think that carbon credits and these biodiversity credits are the solutions, and oftentimes they say that we are limited in why we're criticizing or critiquing these things, when in reality it's like this holistic nature or holistic thinking as that is kind of leading us to criticizing or critiquing these binary solutions that are, I don't, they just don't make sense, as
They
you
just don't
mentioned, from
make sense.
from ecological standpoint. Yeah.
I've had so many arguments at conferences, gentle arguments, some not so gentle, uh, with people who work at institutions, and like you can see they care. Oh, they really desperately care. Particularly people who work for the UN. Oh my God, they care. They are frightened. They are worried, and they will be like, "But what? But what else can we do?" And I'm like, "What do you mean? What else can we do? We can use less. Use less. There you go. Put an energy cap on, put a materials consumption cap on, limit what people can do, stop building shit that is going to break in a couple of years. Like, there are things that we can do tomorrow that would be more effective. And we are completely limited by the assumption that capitalism will continue, despite the fact that capitalism needs a huge amount of material inputs and materials are being used up. We are running out because of the extent of human activity on the planet. And I write this, I'm working on a book at the moment, and I write it in the book like, God, what boring dystopia. Like, really? This is the best we could do?
And eventually you make a lot of them uncomfortable. So they just want to run away. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had to work on my people skills doing this job. Yeah, a little bit uncomfortable, but I think they know. This is the thing. I think a lot of
Yeah, they
people,
know.
yeah, right? I've
Mhm.
never
Yeah.
met somebody that was like surprised by the analysis. I've met
No,
people that
they know.
Complete. And this is the thing. This is the thing that I find so funny about this moment of like um eco crisis, as I like to call it. Everybody feels it. We either feel it in our bodies, or we know it from our research, or we can see it happening on the news, and we're just this is like collective delusion that everything will be fine if we just keep going, despite the direction of travel, or that surely we're going to figure it out. We have no evidence that we're going to figure it out, but surely we will figure it out. And if we just stopped putting so much effort into kidding ourselves, we probably could figure it out.
Mhm. Yeah, I think so. And even like when we talk about like climate science, when we talk about these solutions, everything has been made into a political argument or political division, where it's like this party, and I don't know if in Australia the party system, but like this party is more into climate change. So that means that we gotta be against it because we're from the other party, political party. And it's just fascinating to see that in the global stages, where it's like this country doesn't like this country, so they're gonna make it like a political kind of debate, where it's like, well, we don't agree with what this country ever puts out. So if they believe in climate change, we're not gonna believe in climate change, even though it's impacting us in our own backyard. And I don't know. It's just sometimes the minds of politicians or political leaders or even scientists or these people, like we were mentioning, who know that carbon credits and biodiversity credits are not the best solution. I don't know why. I guess it's limited, right? And I think you're mentioning because that's the only solution they can think of. But yeah, sometimes it doesn't make sense, and it gives you a headache trying to find out why they're thinking that. Like, to be honest.
Completely. I think because a lot of these people are ultimately displaced from land. If I
Mhm.
think about, you know, the CBDs, like the central business districts of cities, there's often no trees, lots of fancy glass skyscrapers, but genuinely just no sign of the natural world, often in the center of the city. So you have to get, you know, you have to go quite far in order to get any sense of there being a world apart from the human one. And I think that plays a huge part in it. That people can't imagine why these things won't work because they actually believe the human version of the story because they're not confronted with reality often enough, essentially.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. And even working in offices, right? Sometimes you're so removed from nature. And if you're working in these buildings, you continue to lose that touch from nature. And I think that oftentimes it's these people who are making these solutions that are working in these buildings and don't cannot go and hug a tree, right? Because there's no
Yeah.
trees around their vicinities.
That's the lesson, everyone. Go and hug a tree. Jessica, I've so enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you so much. My final question for you is, who would you like to pluck?
Oh, there's so many people. Let's see. I would say this person that I know, her name is Anjali Ranadiva. So she leads a wolf sanctuary, a wolf sanctuary. So I think that oftentimes it kind of reminded me of her and the work that she does, because you mentioned how as animal species we often see other animals as less than, and I think that with wolves there is like a lot of political debates, because even between humans and wolves, right? Because sometimes wolves eat cattle or they eat chickens, and ranchers are usually against them. So they try to pass these bills that to allow people to kill wolves, and I think that would be a good person to platform.
Oh, brilliant. I've never had anybody suggest someone like that. I'm wonderful. Jessica, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for everything.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.